Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Cosmos Society online open house. My name is Keith DeStone, and I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Maria Xanthou today to be our guest, our returning guest. Maria is close to our hearts as an active member of the Cosmos Society and is currently a senior research associate at the University of Bristol. She teaches Greek civilization and culture at the Hellenic Open University and is a visiting research fellow at the Seeger Center at Princeton for Hellenic Studies, and is also, I should mention, a research associate at our own Center for Hellenic Studies. Maria's interests are quite broad-ranging, as you'll see if you look at her academic bio on our website. So I'll limit myself to announcing today's topic, which is the Muses' white noise, the background of soundscape, and the gustatory acoustics of Pindar's epinician odes. It sounds like a delicious topic, and Maria, I can't wait to hear what you have cooked up for us. So, welcome.
Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you as a host of the CHS Open House series for extending this invitation to me and all members of our Cosmos Society community. Elens, Sarah, Janet, and of course my wonderful colleague Masha Chlumovic. She's here. She's one of the Pindarists, of the main Pindarists of our community, and I'm glad she's here. And of course, Ian and all members, Maria, Eugenia, everyone. So today I'm going to invite you to focus on a close reading of Isthmian 2, and I will also offer you some examples of what I called the taste of sound, the Pindaric soundscape, and the gustatory acoustics of Pindar's epinician odes. Talking about the ancient soundscape and auditory culture in Pindaric, epinician, and hymnic poetry is like carrying coals to Newcastle or bringing odes to Athens. The emphasis on terms denoting song and dance, hearing and seeing throughout most Pindaric odes, whether epinician or Celtic, is unmistakable. The sound celebrating an affecting victory is also metonymically linked, as we all know, either to Muse or to Muses and their art. This means that praise and any musical composition is often presented as a sonic outcome being triggered and produced by the very pronouncement of the victory, like, for example, in Pythian 4. This metonymic link is documented by the lemma moisa in William Slater's Lexicon to Pindar. If we look up the lemma, and I mean the lemma moisa, we realize that its second part is divided into two different semantic sections. The first one refers to Muse or Muses as a semi-personified figure providing inspiration and song. The second one equals Muse or Muses to music, the art par excellence they communicate or bestow upon the poet. These suggestions are linked to the kernel of my argument, which is that the sound Muses produce equals to what may be called white noise. In that sense, they produce a sort of white noise which acoustically provides the music background of a fully shaped song. In many cases, the poet acts as a music engineer who adjusts the equalization between white noise and celebratory hymns to ensure a balanced mix. I would like now to refine this argument by briefly discussing fragment 150 in Snell-Meller, the famous Manteveo Moisa Profateuso Dego, which is translated, give me an oracle and I shall be a spokesman, your spokesman. I deliberately changed William Race's translation of prophatas to prophet because, as Boris Maslov suggested in his analysis, the fragment records the procedure of delegated discourse and evokes the official practice of oracular consultation in Delphi, which involved two distinctive functions, those of mantis and of prophates. Though, as Maslow notes, the speaker remains unidentified due to lack of context and parallel texts, I agree with his two implied parallelism. First, between Pythia and the Muse or Muses as conduits of the divine voice, and second, the oracle officials and the Pindaric speaker, whoever she or he is, as the promulgators announcing to the inquirer their response in the form of dactylic hexameters. Musicae, as the etymological derivative of the muse or the muses, indicates the seamless union of instrumental music, coordinated physical movement, and poetic word, and as a term was one of the first, if not the first, of the technae nouns formed in aike ending, thus reflecting its early conceptualization as a craft with established practices and principles. According to Maslow, muse or muses as eponymous deities act as keen overseers of this union and professional realm. His suggestion entails that the poets act as specialists in the verbal act of musicae. However, we should always have in mind that when a poet, whether epic or choral, invokes the muse, the poet is not merely asking for technical help, may I remind you, for example, Herodotus, but rather for knowledge of past events, access to truths hidden or evading from human minds, the immortalization of subject of the poem, or the enhancement of its performance. The poet is asking for some quality which lies beyond the poet's own powers. So, musicae derives equally from inspiration from the muse or the muses as the divine overseers and craftsmanship dependent on human experience and expertise. At this point, I would like to bring together and show the compatibility of the notion of moi san prophatas as defined or illustrated by Maslow and the concept of craftsmanship. For Maslow, prophatas is one who speaks on behalf of others. Accordingly, to be a poet is to be a spokesman of the muses, like, for example, Tiresias acts as a spokesman of Zeus, or the Delphic priests act as the spokesman of the Pythia. Despite the underlying tension between poetry as an inspiration of the muses or as a craft, the earliest attestation of poetic inspiration is found in Hesiod's Theogony, where the muses breathe into him, into Hesiod, a wondrous voice, auden thespin, giving him the ability to sing of the future and of the past and to celebrate the gods who live forever. It seems that what the muses breathe into Hesiod is a wonderful voice, a faculty with which he is permanently endowed. So, on the one hand, muse or muses favor poets, instruct them, or offer them the inspiration of poetry as a gift. But poets also still have control over what they do. Hence, we have to understand prophatas as spokesman of or promulgator who shapes the voice of muse or muses into comprehensible words and coherent utterances. In that sense, the poet is not passive and dependent on the muse, thus acting as her mouthpiece. Instead, he is active and directly involved in the practice of his art through the inspiration of the muses. This active and direct involvement is inherently linked with modern problematization of the relationship between language, sound, and art. Sean Gert, in his auditory philology article, noted that speech is not an acoustic or is not just an acoustic phenomenon. The acoustic phenomenon is vibration, but a cognitive achievement and an act of the mind. Following this line of thought, he reminds us that language is a structure that goes deep into the musculature of the mouth and the organization of cognition, thus, in a way, reminds us other philosophers. And of course, Noam Chomsky, who already has done research into this. Another point of consideration is our attempt to reconstruct Pindar's voice or noise in his composition. So the essential question arising from this train of thought is the following. Do we have Pindar's voice and noise in his composition? Do voice and noise comprise two different aspects of sound? A straightforward answer might be a positive one. In terms of cognition, conceptualization, and even imagination, praise is matched with the sounding voice, a phonan, as implied in fragment 121. Line 4. Thnaske de sigathen kalon ergon. And in some instances of the same noun, phona, or the noun ops, which means voice, especially of singers, in Slater's lexicon. Sylvia Montillo notes, and I quote, that it is an act of phonation of making itself heard, unquote. So, this voice is preferably a loud one. It takes delight in ringing sound as suggested by keladeo, a verb meaning to celebrate in loud tones, unquote. Neyman 4, lines 6 to 8, offers us an additional approach to this voice and noise issue. In Neyman 4 we read, "For the word lives longer than deed, which with the grace's blessing the tongue draws from the depths of the mind." In these verses, poetry is presented as a sonorous outcome of the words or utterances stored in the poetic mind, and its coming into being depends on the restless movement of the physical vocal organ of the tongue. If we follow Shane Butler's suggestion that the voice that is recorded in ancient writing is not an individual voice, but rather a general voice, not a voice, not just voices, but the voice, Olympian 3, in lines 4 to 9, offers us a possibly articulate example. In Olympian 3, we read, "And for that reason, I believe the Muse stood beside me as I found a newly shining way to join the Dorian measure, a voice of splendid celebration, because crowns bound upon his hair exact from me this divinely aspired debt, to mix in due measure the varied strains of the lyre, the sound of pipes, and the setting words for Ainesidamos' son, and Pisa too bids me lift up my voice." In this passage, Pindar mingles the rhythmic template of the dactyloepitrite meter with the auditory image of the shout of the auloi, boan aulon, in conjunction with his linguistic artistry, epeonte thesin, translated into the setting of words, and the invocation of the lyre's tonal complexity, forminga poikilogarun. Pindar's innovation may lie in blending words, lyre, and aulos to produce a cheerful and celebratory noise. What is notable here is that he holds himself responsible for this blending, as I mentioned earlier, and its sonic outcome through the infinitive in verse 5, enarmoxai. Butler argues that ancient education was the site of the production of what he calls, and I quote, playback machines, unquote, capable of generating the voices of the poets and the orators. He also argues for the centrality of trained voices to the transmission and appreciation of song, even when it is transmitted it in writing without musical notation. Sorry. This last suggestion of the trained voices reminds us of another much debated issue, which I do not to press, I don't intend to press on, due to time restrictions, and is once again the training of the chorus for the Kibdelon Sun. My presentation consists of three strands which are interwoven with one another. The first one is the interrelation between the sound Muses produce and the different sensory modalities that I mentioned earlier. The second strand is the use of silence. There are instances where silence, hesukia, is presented as a sympotic sine qua non prerequisite for a celebration to come forth with the help of sweet wine, like for example the case in Nehemiah 9. This leads me to press on a relevant issue. The role of hesukia as prerequisite for the epinician or Celtic performance, or as a background for the production of sound and or voice. But does hesukia mean or imply the lack of sound or voice? Hesukia is again, as we all know, a multifarious concept, as especially in Pindar, as it refers to social peace, quiet, calm, but also rest from usually athletic toil. At first, this lack of noise seems incongruous to the sonorous celebration or the sonorous landscape of the athletic victories. However, in my view, hesukia acts as the initial condition before, during, and after the celebration, which contributes to the amplification of the song. One special occasion or manifestation of deliberate silence in epinician composition to which I would like to draw attention is Pindar's deliberate abrupt cut or interruption of his mythic narration by means of short phrases that advocate the necessity of silence, or what other scholars call it, and I quote, aptness of silence, or again I quote, limits of hymns. These phrases and their surrounding context usually are known with the German term Abbruchsformel, suggest that silence as a structural device participate in the fashioning of the poet's words. And as we all know, the most famous examples of this kind of deliberate reticences are Olympian 1 in lines 52-53, and I read, "But for my part, I cannot call any of the blessed gods a glutton. I stand back. Impoverishment is often the lot of slanderers." And another example is Nehemiah 5, lines 14 to 18. And again I read, "I shrink from telling of a mighty deed, one ventured not in accord with justice, how in fact they left the glorious island, and what fortune drove the brave men from Oinona. I will hold, for not every exact truth is better for showing its face, and silence is often the wisest thing for a man to observe." However, it is sound which lies at the heart of epinician composition. In Olympian 10, 76-77, we come across the best possible illustration of the sonorous effect of a victory and the soundscape of an epinician or Celtic celebration surrounding this victory in its full glory. These two verses should become our point of departure into the investigation. The poet exploits the contrast between the past and the present, then and now, and tries to bridge the gap with a series of what we call literary techniques, such as personifications and also imagery. For example, after his poetic apology for the belated composition in lines 1 to 12, and the necessary details of training, contest, and its celebration, which frame the aetion of the first Olympic Games, the description of the first Olympic festival offers a detailed account of the sacred topography. And I explain. Heracles consecrates Zeus's precinct, creates a space for banquets around it, erects 6 altars, and names the unnamed hill. Fates and the personified concept of time act as the spectators of honor. The ancient scholia on this particular passage or lines or verses informs us that the fates present is a requirement so as to spin, in other words, to secure the future for the newly founded festival, and time's presence ensures that the registration of Olympic Festival in the inaugurated sacred space to the illustrious and long-lived festivals, while time's onward march reveals the same an uninterrupted succession of future celebrations modeled on the archetypal Olympic one, the protogonos teleta in verses 60 to 77. In the brief description of the first archetypal Olympiad, foreshadowing all the consecutive ones, Pindar strikes a balance between competition and community as he focuses on the wishes and achievements of the contestants. After the list of winners in the 7 major sports, namely stadium, wrestling, boxing, horse chariot race, javelin, and discus throwing, Pindar veils the tensions that result from the conflicting hopes of the various groups of spectators for the athletes whom they support by designating this audience of the first Olympic Games as Sumakia, which corresponds to the holon straton in line 43. This designation, coupled with the special mention of Oionosis' army, brought from Medea in verse 66, points to the heterogeneity of the audience and the different hopes and wishes for different victor, cleverly veiled under the harmonious but sonorous dominance of a great cheer or applause. In Olympian 10, we read, Thoribon paraithuxe megan. This cheerful momentum of harmony continues further with the songs and the festivities ringing all over the temenos as the culmination of the games. These festivities, a source of sheer terpsis, and this is what uh, we have to deal with, what we call gustatory acoustics for victors and defeated alike, along with the comastic mode celebration, ton engomion amphitropon, result the celebratory euphrosune, also shared by the harmonious community of spectators and participants. I would like now to put at work the theoretical framework I have presented so far and focus on the interrelations between different sensory modalities that underline Isthmian 2. In other words, I would like to invite you to read with me and discuss how the gustatory sense complements its visual and acoustic aspects, especially in Isthmian 2. I will also argue that gustatory sense is privileged over other senses in Isthmia too, and hence the eye, taste, sound, synesthetic concept contributes to the aesthetic and literary appreciation of this particular ode, although this may not apply only to this ode, but also to other odes as well. My main argument is that Pindar uses synesthetic connotations of highly charged literary terms so as to invite the audience of Isthmian 2 to participate in an imaginary symposium. This participatory notion is enhanced through sensory effects, through words, which denote mainly visual, acoustic, and gustatory senses. The backdrop of the sensory landscape in Isthmian 2 is namely acoustic. In order for a feast to be complete, almost all the senses, the gustatory, the acoustic, and the visual, should be addressed and satisfied. Pindar is not alone in using such a range of senses. In other examples of early poetry, like and if you read the handout number 2, you're able to see that I refer to Iliad 1, 601, 604, the Homeric hymn to Apollo, 511, 516, and Hesiod to the Shield, 272, 285, present some good examples of a hierarchy of senses. The gustatory first, and then the acoustic blurred with the visual. The proemion of Isthmian 2 presents an almost inverted hierarchy of senses than the previous example, like for example the Iliad 1 example. So far, little attention has been paid to the interplay between the noun and their governing epithets in the proem of Isthmian 2. The first sensory clue comes with the epithet chrysambikon, attributed to Moisan, where gold is introduced as a symbol of radiance, probably imperishability, and ultimately eternity. This is handout number 3. The introduction of golden radiance corresponds to the later on qualification of victory as gold. Through the association of Cruz and Beacon with horses, we are prepared for the chariot of the Muses. The adjective kluta forminge, which is usually translated glorious, derived from Cleo, this is handout number 4, which means famous, and I believe that although the adjective is translated as glorious, renowned, famous, it also bears the semantic nuances of the physicality of sound and its perception, thus intended to mean being heard, resounding, or being attentive. This nuance is embedded in the etymology of cluo here, and the productive suffix tos, which adds to the adjective the notion of being able, like the Latin ending of bilis, like mirabilis. Another semantic option is that of belonging to a god or godly. This semantic notion is already cited in Odyssey, book number 9, and in verse 364, in case you need to look it up. Therefore, I'm more inclined to attribute to it the nuance of there, since the motive introduced is the man of long ago, and the credentials of the art are already implied by the Hesiodic parallel Chrysambikon Moisan in Hesiod Theogony 916. If Cluta is interpreted as a possessive there, in the sense of already known, with the one you are already acquainted with, it implies an intimate knowledge of the art of the men of the past, which matches the ironic tone of the poem. The adjective meligarias in line 3 of Isthmian 2, governing the collocation hymnus paideus, adds especially sensory qualification to the noun hymnus. The epithet meligarius is already found in Homer and elsewhere, and this is handout number 5. In Pindar, it usually qualifies hymnoi, komoi, ompha, and sweetness as a gustatory sense is usually related with the aesthetic value, appraisal, and reception of the song. However, I think that the compound melee is also related visually with the golden color. This is handout number 6. In the poem, and in particular in Isthmian too, the Muses are qualified as decorated with golden trappings, while immediately the hymns of love are called honey sounding. Moreover, the closest parallel in prose where gold clothes and the love of beautiful boys are mentioned and enumerated as objects of beauty is in Plato's Symposium. This is handout number 7. And I read the translation that if you ever see it, will not seem to you to be of the same order as golden clothes and the beautiful boys and young men that now drive you out of your mind. Ekpeplixai is the term, when you see them, so that both you and many others, kai su kai aloi poloi, are ready so long as you can see your beloveds and be with them always, if that were somehow possible, to stop eating and drinking and just gaze at them and be with them. What then, she said, do we suppose it would be like if someone succeeded in seeing beauty itself, pure, clean, unmixed, and not contaminated with things like human flesh and color and much other mortal nonsense? According to Ralph Rosen, this is probably not meant to imply that Socrates is obsessed with man and fashion, but simply that he can appreciate the beauty of gold or of fine clothing, regardless of how much value he would allot to them. So the visual effect of radiance is implied in Isthmian 2, line 8. The interplay between Pindar's poem, this is handout again number 8, and also Alkmann's Parthenion in lines 57 points to the excessively affected look of Aoi Dai. In other words, speaking of the venal poetry of his time, Pindar mentions, and I quote, sweet, soft-voiced songs with their faces silvered over, unquote, thus alluding to women with excessive makeup and playing on arguronitos and similar um, qualifications. On the other hand, the radiant glaze of Horagos's face, Hagisihorasis, namely, corresponds to the visual effect of her beauty. This interpretation invades the intricacy of Pindar's allusion. Apart from silver-faced and sweet, the songs Aoidai are called melifongoi. The epithet also occurs elsewhere in Pindar. This is again handout number 9. And I accept that the conjecture on melifongoi is superfluous, since there is the attested parallel already in Olympian 6, line 21, melifongoi moisai, which is usually understood as honey voiced. However, I believe that in the particular occurrence of this epithet, there are also visual and especially chromatic connotations or nuances. To call the Muses honey voiced, whereas they have been already called sweet, is somehow redundant. The epithet may echo the aforementioned Meligarias hymnus in verse 3 of Isthmian 2. But it may also allude to the etymological interplay between meli and melos, as in Plato's Ion in 534 AB. In addition, in the particular Pindaric passage, it may also convey the golden color of the metallic pitch of Aoi dye, if the first compound meli is to be understood as the equivalent of the color of xanthos, as Simonides implies, and therefore a metonymy of gold as a metal. Almost in the same fashion, light is the visual phenomenological effect of fame and splendor achieved through from athletic deeds in Isthmian 2, 17, 18. The visual effect of light is combined with sweetness as gustatory sense in Nemean 7, 52. This is handout number 10. In verses 17, 21, the visual these verses reinforce the visual effect of radiance as the metonymy for glory due to athletic victory. The collocation evarmaton andra is to be coupled with the phrase agragantinon phos, and both refer to Xenocrates, and this is again handout number 11. After citing Xenocrates' Isthmian victory in verse 13, the poet adds as an appendix Xenocrates' Pythian and Panathinaik victory. The Pythian victory is mentioned in verse 17 of Isthmian 2 and the Panathinaik in verse 19. The visual tenor of Xenocrates' metaphorical characterization as Phaos Akragandinon, and I quote, allied to the people of Akragas, is further sustained by the noun Aglaian in verse 18, meaning splendor, a synonym to glory achieved by his athletic victory in the Pythian Games, and the cadence of athletic victories is rounded off by Xenocrates' Panathinaik victory, as it is evidenced in verse 19, Kleinais charitesin, the glorious favor. In the next line, verse 20, radiance is attributed to Athens in the form of an epithet that supports the distinctive visual effect of glazing glory in shining Athens, which is also mentioned in Nemean 4:18, li paran euvonymon apathanan, or in fragment 76. The epithet itself is considered formulaic and thus commonplace as it characterizes other cities like Marathon, Orchomenos, Naxos, Thebes, and Smyrna. The concluding collocation in verse 21, Plaxipoio photos, the horse-striding man, corresponds to Evarmaton Andra in verse 17, the men of fine chariots, though different in meaning and semantics, since the first collocation refers to Xenocrates, while the latter to Nicomachos, Xenocrates' charioteer. At this point, I cannot resist from suggesting that the glory of Xenocrates is gradually transferred to, or to be more precise, affects Nicomachos, Xenocrates' charioteer, whom Pindar decides to include in his ode by mentioning his contribution to Xenocrates' achievement. Pindar also accredits Nicomachos with an Olympian victory won for Xenocrates' brother Theron in verses 23-29. It is notable that this particular Olympian victory is personified as a goddess and called golden, a usual collective characterization of female godly groups, like, for example, the Horae, the seasons, Themis' daughters by Zeus, although in Isthmian 8, line 5, this is, and elsewhere, this is handout number 12, the Muse is also called golden. The Olympic victory mentioned in our poem is one won by Theron in 476 BCE, and Theron's charioteer was Nicomachos, whom Pindar praised in lines 21-28. In these verses, Pindar offers a succinct description of Nicomachos' intervention and steering Theron's chariot and horses fittingly, kata kairon, to victory. Despite the ambiguity of the description in verses 20-21, we understand that Nicomachos' wise steering of the chariot led to victory. The double mention of the charioteer as Plaxipoio photos at the end of the strophe and then the name of Nicomachos at the beginning of the antistrophe introduces the praise of the charioteer and helps transition from Xenocrates' victories in Isthmus, Delphi, and Athens to Theron's victory in Olympia. At this point, I would like to add 4 additional observations. The epithet rusidifron and the noun photos in genitive, singular, recall the introductory imagery of the men of long ago who used to mount the Muses' chariot in the first strophe. This is lines 1-2. Theron and ultimately Nicomachos are presented as a modern version of peers who know how to steer the chariot successfully. Their success calls for the composition of honey sweet songs. Second observation, Theron's Olympic victory triggers mentioning Aenesidamos' sons and joins them together. Third observation, apart from Xenocrates, his son Thrasybulus, and Theron's brother, Nicomachos is included in the companion of the victors as the charioteer of the Emenidae of Akragas, namely Theron. His inclusion is certainly attributed to the well-known topos of Pindaric poetry, in other words, mentioning the charioteer of a victory. And fourth and last observation, I also think that Pindar alludes to the concluding word photos, which again, I repeat, is singular genitive, which refers to Nicomachos, to the phrase akragantinon phaos, referring to Xenocrates. In a way, he lends some of Xenocrates' glazing glory to Nicomachos through etymological play between phaos and photos, although pho and phos as a man. With verse 24, Pindar introduces the motif of philoxenia, which is further elaborated in lines 28-32. The verb aspazomai occurs only once in Pindar and the whole corpus of early Greek poetry. It is notable that although aspazomai means greet or salute, in epic the greeting involves physical contact like in handout number 13. The notion of haptic and gustatory effect features in the epithet hadupno governing the noun phona. And although Verdenius interprets the epithet as meaning pleasantly or kindly disposed, in verse 28-32, Pindar picks up the motif of philoxenia and elaborates on it. The adjective melikompon echoes the meligarias in verse 3. The noun kompos is a common compound used in the favorable sense of loud praise elsewhere in Pindar, like in Nemean 8, in Isthmian 1, and Isthmian 5. The word carries auditory display. The haptic sensory effect is employed by the imagery in verse 33, and the gustatory effect is capped by presenting Xenocrates' mental disposition, which differs from Physis in emphasizing the dynamic and emotional aspects of a character, from thumos in being the source of intentions rather than impulses. The Xenia motif caps Pindar's praise of Xenocrates. The epithet aidoios glosses the phrase organ glukeian due to its active sense, which means having regard for others. The noun astois, to be connected with aidoios and homilane, evokes the notion of participation and connectivity within the community. Xenocrates' communal status was defined by three standards. First of all, by having regard for others. Secondly, by practicing horse breeding in the Pan-Hellenic tradition. And of course, thirdly, by welcoming all the feasts of the gods. The Xenia motive caps so the enumeration in lines 39-40. Conclusions before the end of this talk, and of course the questions that are going to follow. In my examination of Isthmian 2, I attempted to decode Pindar's frequent resort to sensory terms, mainly adjectives. Isthmian 2 is marked by the fusion of tropes achieved by later Pindaric poetry. The celebration of an athletic victory achieved by a member of the Emenida, one of the prominent families of Sicilian tyrants, invites for a due measure of celebratory tone, exclusivity, and also participation of the civic body. The image of Xenocrates, the winner of the Pythian chariot race, celebrated by Pythian 6, as being in company with his drinking companions, and his spirit surpassing the perforated labor of bees, which is called in Greek terms melissan treton ponon, is further elaborated through a highly sensory staging of a participatory celebration charged with sexual overtures and steadfast focused on the notion of philoxenia. The interrelations between different sensory modalities are built through the use of adjectives qualifying nouns that evoke major principles of Pindaric soundscape and poetics. This nexus of sensory modalities serves the staging of an imaginary participatory celebration with the members of the Emenidae family as patrons. In a way, aesthetic consumption through sensory modalities equals to aesthetic appreciation. Thus, the evocation of the senses advances aesthetic appreciation in the form of eros, acts as an initiating medium to participation and educational practice of approbative civil discourse. So thank you very much for your focus, and this is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Maria. That was wonderful. Let me just switch back to everyone now that it's time for questions. Does anyone have any questions immediately that come to mind? I've got one, but Masha, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Maria, so much for this. Really, given your subject, I feel like we got a feast, a sensory feast, okay, focusing on gustatory sound. I really like that expression. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and there is really so much there in Pindar with all sorts of senses. We do focus on audio, visual, but I'm really grateful you were picking up on these gustatory elements as well. My question is really out of curiosity, because I myself I don't know, I haven't noticed any that subject, and it has to do with references to um, as you pointed out, song and dance, and especially song in particular, so voice, as opposed to instruments. Because I didn't catch in Isthmian 2 any specific references, but I think you had from Olympian 10, and in other odes it's a very common,
Mhm.
especially lyre and pipe as instruments. But I'm wondering if you noticed as big a wealth of sort of combining of different senses when it comes to instruments as well, or is there any difference? Do we sense that there's any priority given to voice over instrument or none?
Over voice to instrument.
Or if there's any difference in sort of how they're
I can't speak about the overall corpus of Pindar because I haven't investigated throughout the corpus about this combination that you wonderfully mentioned. And by the way, thank you very much for your question. I think this is your point is very useful for further investigation. I've already focused on. Isthmian too, and I try to find certain examples that, in a way, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, I think that in a way the voice and the noise is there. But what Pindar is trying to do is act like, in a way, an equalizer. I don't know whether so far is giving any precedence, if I understand you correctly, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, if he gives any precedence to the sound, the voice or noise of the instruments over the music, but he certainly gives precedence to muses. This is where it all comes from. And of course, now the second phase would be to combine what the muses are conveying to him with the instruments that you correctly mentioned, and also with the dance. I don't know whether you have any parallels in mind, any particular parallels about this coordination between sound, the muses, everything that is conveyed by the muses to the poet, the sound, the instruments, and the dance.
not that I can think of the top of my head all of these and so explicitly. I think one of the nice ambiguities is that choros is of course both sound and visual dance, whereas I think of the three, the instrument, the voice, and the core, the movements, the dance movements, those are the ones least
Mhm.
referred to, right? And no, and thank you for that explanation. That it really, if we go back to Muse, then I guess even my question is unnecessary, because she ultimately not coordinates, but it all stems from the muse, both the muse, the sound and the visual, and so there shouldn't be any difference with the instruments. For example, how voices gets described in terms of these other senses as well. Thank you so much. This was really there is so much to.
No, thank you for your question, because I think your question is a key. It features also again what is fundamental to Pindaric poetry, and thank you for reminding us that the Pindaric poetry is not just about the sound that that unfortunately has been lost to us, what is conveyed through the muse, but it also has to do, okay, with acoustics, as you well said, but also with the dance. Now, the thing is how all this is coordinated and how also it is perceived by, and they should be also coordinated by what we are calling the social context of the performance. You know better, since you are a Pinterest yourself, that we have like different social contexts. So how all this work, how this coordination is most effective in different social contexts, like in a symposium, in a one-time performance, in a civic context, that, for example, one of Pindar's patrons has organized, in a performance which is scheduled right after the victory, in a re-performative context. Probably you know all how this works, and maybe you can more comment on that's why I think this is a very intriguing question what you asked.
Well, I don't want to monopolize the time, but just to respond, because I think you made me realize why I actually asked the question. You reminded me just now why you asked the question, because when it was getting formulated in my head, I was thinking about what about different, as you were just pointing out, different scenarios for re-performance.
Exactly.
I personally am convinced that Pindar had in mind, not necessarily specifically, this is how I want it to be re-performed, but the idea that it would be, and to make this, to make his composition as open to as many contexts, as many occasions, as many different performances. And that's, I think, where sort of a question popped into my head. If I'm right, which I may not be, if that is your primary as a composer, if that's what you have in mind, then it would seem to me that the sound of the voice really carries the most weight, because the dance movements in particular, but even the musical accompaniment, you would imagine, would change depending on.
Exactly. You're right.
And I think maybe that's why later when I asked you, I didn't realize where it came from, but as you were talking now, I realized, oh, that's what I was thinking when I thought maybe the other references to instruments and dancing are not as laden with these rich metaphors of other senses, because they won't necessarily survive in the same form in subsequent performances.
And also, if we may add a conclusion to this wonderful question of yours, if we are able to reach a conclusion, is probably one thing, a key to the major answer of this presentation. Why, for example, Pindar uses gustatory acoustics. Why all this imaginary? It's not just a literary trope, or because, but he uses it, as you rightly pointed out, as a means in order to his song to be in a way personalized or adapted in a sense in different social contexts. So it's the adaptability of the song, especially, you know, the epinician song, is also based through this synesthesia, this synesthetics term that may convey more easily and adapt. That's why I'm using the term adaptability, um, to adapt the song according to a different performative setting.
A setting in which the gustatory references
Exactly.
would be imaginary, perhaps.
Imaginary, exactly. And of course, so the audience might feel privileged, equally privileged. That's why I added the qualification participatory, and not feel being excluded, like, for example, the context of a patron's symposium, where only few, the privileged few, for example, were invited. And in a way, this also serves Pindar's patron.
Janet, I saw that you had a question.
Thank you, Maria, for this wonderful presentation. I am impressed by Pindar's awareness of his presence in his art. And when he's composing, you said in different situations, he is also aware that he's not only surviving his time, but many years after he will be read.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe more than the if I call it ordered poem.
Mm-hmm.
He has a problem. Does he have a problem with money? Because there's a line, Muse was not yet greedy for gain or hire. Money makes man. Is this a self-critic on him, or he is, critiquing the competition?
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, Jana. I think this is a very, again, a very important question, because Isthmian too has been interpreted as, Masha can also confirm, through different perspective and different aspects. In antiquity, Pindar was accused that, in a way, yes, he liked to be paid accordingly, according to his artistry, and he knew that, and he reinforced this, as you well put it. In my opinion, Isthmian too is a tour de force of what you said, of Pindar's self-awareness as an artist, that, I know how to make you immortal, or I know you how to immortalize your Kleos, I know how to immortalize your victory. However, this also self-awareness should be interpreted or approached, if you like, in what we called the reciprocity, the social exchange of reciprocity in archaic and classical Greece. We all know that in many ways, the world was affected in a way by after, especially after Christianity, with the fact that, sometimes had been given for free. Of course, this is in our morality very well embedded, but somehow in archaic Greece and in classical Greece, things were different. The kleos, the reciprocity, something should be given back. And this is well, for example, illustrated also in relations between heroes in Iliad and the Odyssey. If, for example, you have a high esteem for someone, you have to give him something precious. So, as I told you, Isthmian too, in a way, is a tour de force, is a self-awareness, but he's very good. He's probably the top artist, and yes, his songs will live forever. And yes, what his songs, I mean, the exchange, the gifts or what he gets in return for his songs will, in a way, corroborate his influence and his profile as a top artist, what he gets in exchange. Yes, I think in Eastman too, what he does is a sheer self-promotion. If we see it like this, yes. But in terms of economic exchange, if we look this particular song in the social context of this particular era, I think this was the case in many intercultural and cross-cultural exchanges and social connections.
Maria Eugenia.
Thank you, Maria. It was wonderful. My question is related to what you've said about these sensorial stuff that are almost adjectives,
Yes.
and the relationship between language as a form of knowing. Because I noticed that, for instance, in line 10, Pindar speaks about aletheia. So, and he says, but now she, the muse, bids us heed the archives adage, which comes closest to the truth. So I think if that adjectives that are sensorial and related to sounds and to the image, taste and the view and the vision are almost, but not, because if not at all, not totally approaching this truth. And it's a way by the adjective and not with nouns to approach the truth. I think it is very important here in Pindar, as well as in Plato, as a propedeutic. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I think, as you very well put it, the adjective, especially in this particular ode, Maria Eugenia, as you rightly put it, act as qualifiers of truth. That's why I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation that Pindar is aware that everything will be conveyed to him through the Muses. By the way, he is not the only one who has this kind of insight. We know that, for example, Herodotus also mentions in his poem that in order to approach the truth, you have to enter into an endeavor of inquiry. You have to search for the truth. And the truth is like, it's not there. I mean, it's not like pre-existing, because we humans have a limitation. We are just approaching the truth by asking, through inquiry, by adding these small, pieces of information in order to try to have a larger picture. Now, as you well said, these adjectives, these epithets, in a way point towards a better approach towards, or a better understanding towards the truth. This might sound that, yes, this sounds like Platonic, as you well put it. I agree. But on the other hand, we have to be very careful, because the aletheia that Pindar is suggesting or implying is not the same like Plato's, okay? Because also Pindar uses the word pseudos, false. What is false in his epinician songs? Of course, we agree that there is a very fundamental concept that in order to find out truth, one needs to search for it. We are not able to know it fully, because this is, of course, a godly, how can I say, a godly sense. Only God knows, only gods know what is true.
Yes, thank you. And for that reason, I think it is related to Hesychia, the silence.
Silence,
Yeah,
absolutely,
yes,
absolutely. And also, may I also add to your point that also Hesychia has also some religious overtones,
yes,
which
of
are
course.
also related, for example, to religious practices, to religious rituals, to rituals where, and let us also not forget that religion, especially in ancient Greece, was about approaching the truth of true life, the truth of gods. How so? This is somehow. Please note my qualifying adverb. This is somehow related.
Thank you very much.
Ellen, yeah, go ahead. Maybe this should be our last question, given the time.
Yeah, this is just a comment. Thank you, Maria, for this beautiful presentation. This is just a connection that with Iliad too, because at the beginning of the catalogue of ships, then the Muses are convoked. You know, he's asking the help of the Muses because they know everything. And the Greek is very specific about that, you know.
Yes.
Te panta. Because you know everything, so it's...
And if I remember correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think that Homer, or the poet of Iliad in book 2, asks the help of the muse in order to enumerate all these names and all these figures, the numbers of the ships.
Exactly, because even if he had 10 tongues and 10 mouths, he couldn't himself do it
Exactly.
alone. Yeah.
So the Muses, the presence of Muses is ubiquitous. This is undeniable. This is unmistakable. What I would like to point out is that in Isthmian too, again, and I'm coming back to Janet's question and point, is that in Isthmian too, we have a tour, what we call in French, you have a wonderful accent, maybe you might be able to, a tour de force of poetic artistry. So Pindar, in a way, of course, says that all my inspiration comes from the Muses, but I'm able to regulate this flow, this overflow of inspiration, and ensure, which is most important for his patrons, ensure your immortality. That this song will be heard again and again and again, as Masha pointed out, in different social contexts.
That's a really wonderful image, Maria, of the regulation of the flow of the inspiration. Thank you for that. And thank you for joining us. As always, we'll see you at another time. And thank everyone else. Thank you all for joining us as well. So see you next time.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It is always a pleasure and an honor to be among our community.